Dr. Weens, I want to weigh in with one thing. 3 months ago, Byron Buck, who's sitting in the back of the room on behalf of the state and federal water contractors agency, came in and said, look, I want to brief you guys on the South Yolo project, which is one of the many projects that are around. And we had an hour, a little more than an hour discussion with also participation from the county and so on. And it struck me that there was a project that, to a relatively high level of certainty, I would say that project or something that looks a whole lot like it is going to happen within the Delta within a relatively short period of time. I mean, the land's already owned by the Westlands Water District. They've already agreed it's to satisfy existing biological opinion obligations, so that means funding for something is there. They have a plan to reconfigure existing land that is already in the floodplain and periodically subject to flooding, but for increased benefits. And then I can't remember, but we roped Dr. Goodwin into the conversation because a bunch of us were pretty enthusiastic about the notion of projects ready to go going. And Peter said, well, I think I'm telling the story correctly. He said, back off for a minute, just think about the things, because McCormick-Williamson tract is very close, if not exactly next to it. And this was just light went off in my head, and I think it was Peter mentioned, and the Meadows, a long existing recreational houseboating area, is not too far from McCormick-Williamson, and the Consumnes River Preserve is not there.
Exactly.
And by the way, one of the things the Delta Plan says, the statute says, that interconnected habitat is of immense value and should be in the Delta Plan. So I just look at that and I say, there is one of the unique opportunities. So how do you back off a project? My experience with all project developers, public, private, nonprofit, builders, and all that is, there are long periods where nothing happens, but if they decide they want to go tomorrow. They don't care about any connections with anything else. They don't care about all these stupid studies. They just want to go. How would the Weens streamlined adaptive management process fit into what, to me, seems like one of the key North Delta discussions where normal political limitations have been substantially removed? It is either the properties that are near each other are either owned by public agencies already or by nonprofits, the Nature Conservancy, and the opportunities are increased for scientific involvement and also improved ecosystem if you just back up a little bit and take a larger picture. How do you make that happen in an expedited process, understanding it doesn't solve all the problems?
I think that's a great example, and that's one of the things we heard about too, and we're equally impressed by the potential there. And the people we talked to were of a mindset to move down that pathway toward greater integration. I'm not sure organizationally what is needed. It's a simple thing to say, well, let's get them together and have them talk. That's a necessary step, but it's probably not sufficient in terms of really instigating the kind of integration that we see as being really necessary and valuable in that kind of situation. You can't use a hammer to make it happen. I think it is a matter of simply trying to work with the people involved, bring them together, and have some kind of overarching coordination of it, some leadership, if you will. Now, whether that would come from the Delta Conservancy, whether that would come from the Delta Science Program, where it would come from, I don't know. But I think with the right kind of leadership that keeps encouraging people, keeps showing them the benefits of them, I think people are prepared to go down that pathway. But you're right, it needs to be done quickly. You can't talk about it and say, well, okay, let's put in a commission and 5 years from now have a report.
I'm not asking for a commitment on this on behalf of the Science Board, but just a thought. How would you and your colleagues feel if Mr. Buck and Peter walked in and said, all right, we've got 90 days to get your opinions on how to get maximum benefit out of this project, but you only have 90 days to do it because they want to move and they know that longer delays will bring into question the ability to complete this. Scientists have not notoriously been wildly enthusiastic about time deadlines of a short nature. But since you mentioned expedited processing of adaptive management, I thought you might have some thoughts on that.
I think scientists working in the Delta need to recognize that they need to move out of their comfort zone to be effective. And I think a good many of them, the ones in the Delta Science Program that we've talked to, certainly are. They're good scientists, but they recognize that, business as usual, which means, plod along and ask more questions than you have answers. That's not the recipe for doing things. I think the people on the Science Board, I think people in some of the agencies, consultants, NGOs, are of a mindset that recognizes that you can't debate the problems forever. I'll go back to what you mentioned at the beginning. Getting the good enough solution is enough to work on if you're prepared then to re-examine it as you go forward. And I think that, I don't know whether this is something that the Science Board is the most appropriate sort of thing to do. I'm certainly not going to volunteer my colleagues for doing that. But I think that something like that could pull together things quickly in a very focused way, panels, study groups, whatever you want to call it, that really have a very sharp focus and a sharp timeline. It's something that's possible.
And thanks a lot.
Mr. Fiorini.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, I just wanted to jump in and say that I think we can revisit this question as the other speakers come up, because some of the efforts going on right now are dealing with that exact issue of bringing together rapid scientific review of projects as they're being developed.
Well, I mean, I understand Mr. Enright, who's speaking later on a slightly different point, has been involved in those discussions, and we can talk about it then. I'm just trying to figure out a structural approach, and my gut tells me that as long as we continue this discussion on an abstract basis, whether it's projects that deserve adaptive management or ones that don't, we'll never get around to figuring out how to get there. We'll just argue about the terms of the abstract principles. And so I look out and I say there are a lot of smaller projects in and around the Delta that have fewer initial problems than others, offer opportunities, but the intervention of science or the council or everyone else means that we also have to be aware of the need to expedite the process as much as we can. And the chair of our implementation committee, Mr. Fiorini, had a question.
Good segue. Your presentation was excellent at defining what should be done. And this is not the first time that we've heard similar outlines.
Oh, yes.
But what's lacking is how and by whom. We're on the verge of trying to determine, from a habitat restoration point of view, what ought to be done on a coordinated planning, implementation, prioritization basis. Can the Independent Science Board help us answer the questions of what and or how and by whom in the next 6 to 8 months, and help us find those projects that meet the criteria of what you just defined as what we should do in terms of interconnectivity and Delta-wide planning and so on and so forth? Can you help us identify what it is that the Delta Stewardship Council should put their shoulder behind and help move along more quickly?
Well, I couldn't very well sit here and say no.
Oh, great. Okay, we've wrapped that one up.
I think the specifics of the Independent Science Board are that we're charged with doing a variety of things, one of which is reviewing the EIR-EIS of BDCP, which may take a bit of time. So how we orchestrate all of these things, I think, is one issue. Putting that aside, I think that the point you raise is something we talked about, and we talked about it with reference to what we should put in this report. Should we go a step beyond this? And there were some people on the board who said we ought to specify for each of those recommendations who does it. And there were others, myself included, who said that isn't really our function. We don't know enough about the institutional responsibilities of these various agencies and organizations to target them, to put a big target on their chest and say, you know, they should do it because the Delta ISB says do it. But I think that psychologically, in a sense, the ISB is prepared to go down that route if we can manage to do so.
Lauren, you want to say something?
Yeah, if I can just add, I think you're going to hear from our next speaker, Campbell Ingram, about some thoughts about doing that and working closely with the Delta Science program and what we've got in our draft Delta Science plan, the combination of those two to help achieve, I think, what you're talking about. I hope.
Well, that's good, because I want to affirm that what we just heard is good about describing what should be done. Now I want to hear how to do it and by whom. And if we don't get answers to those questions today, then Dr. Weems would probably be back to you.
Better get those answers.
Thank you. Well, before we go to the next